He thought he was rescuing the dog. He was wrong. The November rain had turned to sleet by the time Callum Reyes pulled his truck off the highway outside Merrickville, Ontario. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned much of anything in the 2 years since Janet died. He just drove when the walls of the house closed in, which was most evenings now, which was almost every night. The heater in the old Ford had been unreliable since August, and he'd never bothered to fix it. Cold didn't bother him the way it used to. A lot of things didn't bother him anymore. He saw the crate from the road. It was sitting in the gravel pullout beside the guardrail, a wire kennel the size of a steamer trunk, half hidden by the dead grass that had bent over it in the wind. Someone had set it there and driven away. That was the only explanation. There were no houses nearby, no tire tracks leading to a farm lane. Just the crate and the sleet coming sideways off the fields and a shape inside that moved. Callum sat in the idling truck for a full minute. His breath fogged the windshield. In his experience, when you stopped for something broken on the side of the road, it always cost you more than you had to give. He had learned that lesson in other countries, in other kinds of darkness. He had learned it again 2 years ago in the hospital parking lot at 4 in the morning, when the resident came through the glass doors with his hands in his pockets. He got out of the truck anyway. The dog inside the crate was a yellow Labrador, full-grown but thin in the way that meant weeks, not days. She was pressed against the far end of the kennel with her chin on her paws, watching him approach with eyes that didn't ask for anything. That was the part that stopped him cold. Most dogs, even frightened ones, had something in their eyes, hope or fear, or at least the flickering animal instinct to negotiate. This one had nothing. She had stopped expecting. Callum knew that look. He'd seen it in men before. The latch was frozen shut. He worked it with his bare hands until his fingers went numb, then pulled his pocket knife and used the handle as a lever. And finally the door swung open with a sound like a held breath releasing. The dog didn't move. She just watched him, her tan fur matted along one side, her ribs visible when she breathed. "Okay," he said. He wasn't sure who he was talking to. He reached in slowly, the way his wife had always told him to approach animals. Palm down, no sudden movements, let them decide. Janet had been the one who knew about dogs. They'd talked about getting one in the years before her diagnosis, in the years when they still made plans. He lifted the dog carefully, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her to the passenger seat of the truck. She didn't resist. She didn't lean in either. She simply allowed herself to be carried, the way you allow things when you've run out of fight. Callum drove to the nearest vet clinic in Smith's Falls, with the dog sitting upright on the seat beside him, not looking at him, watching the dark road ahead. Her breathing was steady. She didn't whimper. In 22 years as a Navy SEAL, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, work in places he still couldn't name out loud. He had served alongside military working dogs who had more expression in their posture than most people had in their faces. This dog reminded him of that, the composure of something that had survived by learning not to need. The vet clinic was a small building on the edge of town, with a lit sign and a buzzer for after hours. The woman who answered was Dr. Brenda Foss, 50 or so, with short gray hair and the specific patience of someone who had seen most things twice. She took one look at the dog and ushered them both inside without asking questions, which Callum appreciated more than he could say. "Dehydration, mild hypothermia, underweight," Brenda said, moving efficiently around the exam table. "But her vitals are better than they look. She's not in crisis. She's just been badly let down. Can you keep her overnight?" Brenda glanced at him over her glasses. "You planning to come back for her?" He hadn't thought about it. He'd driven 37 kilometers in sleet to a vet clinic he'd never been to, carrying a dog that wasn't his, and he hadn't thought about what happened next. That was how he'd been living for 2 years. One thing at a time, no further than the next hour. "Yes," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. He drove home to Merrickville through weather that was getting worse. The house was the same as he'd left it, which was to say dark and quiet, and full of the particular silence that accumulates in rooms where someone used to be. He'd bought the place with Janet the year he retired from service. A century-old stone cottage, 2 blocks from the Rideau Canal with a garden she'd had plans for. The garden had gone to seed. The bird feeder on the back porch still had sunflower seeds in it from 2 winters ago, because he kept forgetting to take it down. And every time he looked at it, he thought about her standing at the kitchen window, pointing out the chickadees by name. He made tea he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning. He was back at the clinic when it opened at 8. The dog was in a recovery kennel, wrapped in a fleece blanket, eating small amounts of soft food from a shallow dish. She looked up when Callum came into the room. She didn't wag her tail, but she looked at him with something slightly different than the night before. Not hope exactly, more like recognition, like she was filing him away. She had a microchip, Brenda said, registered to an address in Kingston. Owner surrendered her 3 weeks ago to a rescue, but the rescue lost its funding and shut down. My guess is someone from the rescue left her there rather than deal with the paperwork. She paused. Her name is Maple. Callum looked at the dog. Maple looked back. She's lab and something else, Brenda continued. Maybe a little hound in there, probably 4 or 5 years old. Good health underneath all of this. She just needs time and consistency. Time and consistency. Callum had time. He had nothing but time. Consistency was harder. Consistency meant building a routine around another living thing, meant being somewhere at a certain hour, meant the shape of a day having edges again. What do I need to know? He asked. Brenda almost smiled. Come back tomorrow. We'll go through everything. He took Maple home that afternoon in a borrowed crate with a second-hand leash and a bag of prescription food. She sat in the passenger seat again, watching the road. When he pulled into the driveway and opened the door, she stepped out carefully and stood in the dead November grass, looking at the house the way he imagined a person might look at a hotel in a country they'd never planned to visit. It's not much, he said. She walked to the front door and waited. The first week was careful and quiet. Maple ate when he put food down, slept most of the day on the old couch cushion he'd set up near the wood stove, and watched him move around the house with the patient attention of something trying to understand the rules. She didn't chew anything. She didn't bark. She accepted the collar he'd bought at the hardware store without complaint, and walked beside him on the towpath along the canal each morning with a steadiness that felt almost formal, like a new colleague showing up on the first day. Callum didn't know what he'd expected. More drama, maybe. More visible need. People talked about rescue dogs as though saving them was the hard part, but Maple didn't require saving in any of the ways he'd prepared for. She required something simpler and somehow more difficult. She required presence. She needed someone to simply be there, in the same room, going through the same hours. He hadn't realized how bad he'd gotten at that. In the service, presence was never something you thought about. You were embedded in a unit, surrounded by men whose breathing you knew in the dark, whose habits and moods you read the way civilians read weather. Then retirement came, and Janet got sick 18 months later, and for 3 years he had oriented his entire life around her. Her appointments, her medications, her good days and hard ones. When she died, all of that structure went with her. He'd been adrift since, getting up each morning without knowing why, filling hours with nothing he could name afterward. Maple gave the hours a shape. She needed feeding at the same time each morning. She needed the walk, which meant he needed the walk, which meant he was outside before 8 regardless of the weather, moving through the quiet canal-side streets, while the town was still mostly asleep. He started noticing things he'd stopped noticing. The way the frost lay on the footbridge over the lock, the smell of wood smoke from the houses along First Street, the particular gray-pink color of the sky over the old mill at sunrise. He started sleeping through the night, which hadn't happened since Janet was alive. 3 weeks in, the incident with the snowstorm. It came in fast on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of squall that blows off Lake Ontario and catches the valley towns without much warning. Callum had been splitting wood in the backyard when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. He got inside and realized Maple wasn't on her couch. He checked the house room by room, already knowing, the low-level dread already settling in before he got to the back door and found it unlatched. He'd left it open. 30 seconds in December, maybe less, and she'd pushed through. He put on his coat and went out into the snow. Merrickville is a small town, not quite 2,000 people, strung along the Rideau Canal between Ottawa and Kingston. In summer, it fills with tourists come to see the lock station and the antique shops on the main street. In winter, it folds into itself, and the streets are quiet, and the canal freezes over, and the people who stay tend to know one another. Callum hadn't gotten to know anyone. He'd been too deep inside his own house, his own schedule, his own particular form of disappearing. He found Maple 2 streets over, sitting on the front porch of a yellow Victorian house on the canal road, entirely calm, as though she'd been invited. The door of the house opened before he reached the gate. A woman in her 60s appeared on the porch in a thick cardigan and rubber boots. Dorothea Birch, as he would later learn, retired schoolteacher, widowed 8 years ago, keeper of what turned out to be the best-stocked bookshelves in Merrickville. She was looking at Maple with an expression of uncomplicated delight. "Is this yours?" she asked Callum as he came up the walk. "She is. I'm sorry." The door blew open. "Don't apologize. She's been sitting here being very dignified for about 10 minutes. Dorothea crouched down and scratched behind Maple's ears with the easy confidence of someone who'd had dogs before. "What's her name, Maple?" Dorothea laughed, a short, warm sound. "Of course it is." She straightened. "I'm Dottie. You're in the stone house on Isabella, aren't you? I've seen you on the towpath in the mornings. Callum, come in for tea, Callum. Both of you. You look like you've been standing in a snowstorm." He almost said no. He had a whole practiced version of no for situations like this. Polite, brief, leaving no opening for continuation. But Maple was already at the door, and Dorothea was already holding it open, and something about the yellow light spilling out onto the snow made the practiced version feel impossibly small. He went in. Dottie's house was the opposite of his, warm and layered and full of the evidence of a life that had been actively inhabited. Bookshelves in every room, a kitchen table covered in a crossword puzzle, and 2 library books, and a mug that said Prophecy of the RDCDSB. Photographs on the walls, children and grandchildren, and a man Callum assumed was her husband, younger in some pictures, older in others, always smiling the same way. A wood stove going in the front room, a cat who regarded Maple from the top of the bookcase with total indifference. Maple lay down on the kitchen floor as though she'd been doing it for years. Dottie made tea and sliced a piece of apple cake and set it in front of Callum without asking, which was exactly the right thing to do. They talked about the town first, then the canal, then the winter, and then, without quite meaning to, he was telling her about Janet. Not the whole story. He didn't know if he'd ever be able to tell the whole story to anyone. But enough. The garden she'd planned, the bird feeder, the chickadees. Dottie listened without rushing him. When he finished, she didn't say she was sorry, which he'd heard so many times it had stopped meaning anything. She said, "She sounds like someone who paid attention to things. That's a rare quality." He drove home in the dark with Maple in the passenger seat, and something loosened in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. It took him until he was standing at the kitchen sink that he identified it. It was the feeling of having been understood, even slightly, even briefly, by another person. He hadn't felt it in a long time. He went back to Dottie's the following Saturday, this time on purpose. And then the Saturday after that, it was Dottie who introduced him to Art Mendez, who ran the lock station and spent his winters doing community maintenance projects with a small volunteer crew. It was Art who mentioned the breakfast program at St. Lawrence Church that could use another pair of hands on Friday mornings. It was the breakfast program that introduced Callum to Frank and Pauline Soucy, who had been volunteering there since their kids moved to Calgary and whose laughter he could hear from across the hall, and who made him feel, in the most uncomplicated way, like he was in a room where he was welcome. Maple came to all of it. She was not a demonstrative dog. She didn't perform. She didn't do tricks or jump up on strangers or carry toys to the door. What she did was be present, steady and quiet and watchful, and people responded to it in ways that surprised Callum. Children approached her without being invited, and she held herself still for them. Patient in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though she understood what was being asked. Older people reached down to her without thinking, and came up slightly softer than they'd gone down. Art Mendez, who claimed not to be a dog person, started bringing biscuits in his jacket pocket by the 3rd week. She had a way of making a room feel settled. One morning in February on the towpath it happened. The temperature had come up overnight, and the canal ice was groaning in the thaw, a low sound that carried across the water. Maple was walking slightly ahead of him the way she always did now. Not pulling, just leading, setting the pace with the unhurried confidence of something that knew where it was going. A family was coming the other direction. Parents, 2 kids, a stroller. The older child, a girl of maybe 6, stopped dead when she saw Maple and said with complete seriousness, "That dog is talking to me." The parents looked uncertain. Callum started to say something reassuring, but then he looked at Maple. She had stopped too, and was looking at the girl with her head tipped slightly to one side and her tail doing a slow, deliberate sweep. Not the frantic wagging of excitement, but something more careful, more considered. Like punctuation, like she was choosing her words. "She does that," Callum said. The girl reached out and put her hand on Maple's head, and Maple leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. The girl's face went entirely peaceful. "See," she said to her parents, "she's talking." He thought about that for the rest of the walk. He thought about it a lot in the days that followed, because the truth was, Maple had been talking all along. He just hadn't known how to listen. She'd been talking in the way she placed herself between him and the door when the nights got heavy. She'd been talking in the way she pressed her warm weight against his legs when he sat too long at the kitchen table, going nowhere in his head. She'd been talking in the way she stood at the canal's edge on the bad mornings and looked back at him over her shoulder. Not impatient, not demanding, just checking, just making sure he was still there, just making sure he was still coming. The winter passed. The garden came back in the spring in small tentative ways, dandelions first, then the perennial bulbs that Janet had planted the last fall she was well, muscari and early daffodils pushing up through the dead stems. Callum bought a trowel and some compost and spent a Saturday afternoon doing something that felt entirely unfamiliar. And after a while, entirely right. Dottie came by and told him the peonies along the fence needed dividing and stayed to show him how, the 2 of them kneeling in the soft April dirt while Maple supervised from her spot on the porch. He called his daughter in Vancouver that evening, something he'd been not doing for months. Her name was Lee. She was 31 and worked in sustainable forestry and had her mother's voice on the phone, just slightly, in the way she said his name. They talked for 2 hours. She cried a little. He didn't, but it was closer than it had been. She was coming for a visit in July. She wanted to meet Maple. Art called him in May about a project, a bench restoration along the lower lock station that needed an extra set of hands and someone who could do basic carpentry. Callum spent 3 weekends on it, learning that he'd missed working with his hands in a concrete way. Building something you could see when you were finished. He and Art developed the easy, unhurried rhythm of 2 men comfortable with silence, trading tools, and the occasional comment, and the kind of simple companionship that doesn't need a name. On the last day of the project, Art brought coffee in a thermos, and they sat on the finished bench and looked out at the lock while Maple nosed around in the long grass at the water's edge. "You know what she does?" Art said, nodding toward her. "What?" "She walks into a room and everyone relaxes." He considered this. "I've never seen a dog do that. Most dogs, people get alert. Her, it's the opposite." Callum watched her working the grass unhurried, following some private investigation. "She had a hard start," he said. "She learned to be calm because calm was the safest thing to be." Art was quiet for a moment. "Sounds like someone else I know." Callum didn't answer, but he didn't need to. There was an evening in June, the long prairie-style dusk that comes to eastern Ontario in midsummer, when the sky goes pink and gold for what feels like hours. He was sitting on the back porch after supper, and Maple was lying at his feet, and the canal was still, and a heron was standing in the shallows across the water, doing absolutely nothing with supreme confidence. He had a cold cup of tea he'd forgotten about, and the sound of someone's kids playing a street over, and the garden beside the porch, doing what gardens do when you pay attention to them. He thought about the guardrail in November, the sleet, the crate. He thought about carrying her to the truck with no idea what he was doing or why. He'd told himself he was stopping for the dog. He'd told himself he was being practical. You couldn't leave an animal in weather like that. But the truth he hadn't looked at directly until now was that he'd been the one in a cage. He'd built it himself, board by board, in the 2 years after Janet died. Solid walls and a frozen latch and nothing coming in or out. He'd called it grief. It was grief. It was also, he understood now, a choice he'd kept making every morning without examining it. Maple had changed the question, not by saving him in any dramatic way, not by performing some act of animal loyalty that would make a good story, just by requiring presence and consistency and the small regular acts of care that turned out, over time, to be indistinguishable from living. She lifted her head off her paws and looked at him. He looked back. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." She put her head back down, her tail swept the porch boards, once, twice, slow and easy, the way she did things now, like she wasn't in a hurry anymore, like wherever she was, she intended to stay. The heron across the canal stood in its shallow water, and the sky went from gold to something deeper, and the sound of the children playing faded as they were called in for the evening. And the town around them settled into the comfortable quiet of a summer night, and Callum Reyes sat on his porch in Merrickville, Ontario, in the life he was, slowly and without fanfare finding his way back to. He had thought he was rescuing the dog. He understood now that the rescue had gone in both directions, that on a November night on a dark highway in the sleet, two abandoned things had found each other in the cold, and neither of them had been the same since. Not because something dramatic had happened, because something simple had. Someone had shown up.